Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, is today widely celebrated as the author of the Emancipation Proclamation. Many historians believe that he did more than any one person to advance the cause of liberty or freedom in the United States. But had you been around in 1862, you might have been surprised to hear such a thing. Imagine Lincoln alone in the White House, knowing he had an important decision to make. The war hadn't been going well, and it was now time to decide whether or not to abolish slavery. As he falls into a slumber, he has strange dreams. He's visited by his conscience in both forms. On the one hand, the better angel of his nature has reasons why he should abolish slavery. Do it, Abe, I believe in you. Slavery is wrong, after all. You're an abolitionist, you know you are at heart, he might have said. You're also a Republican. Your party was started to end the advance of slavery, the spread of slavery. And you yourself said the United States can't be united if slavery is there to divide it. But Lincoln had his reasons not to abolish slavery. They weren't selfish reasons, but to many of his allies, many of his friends who were abolitionists, it sure seemed so. Don't do it, part of his mind told him. It will destroy you. Lincoln feared that the army would quit if he were to declare the war was a war against slavery. The border states might secede, places like Kentucky and Maryland, and join the Confederacy surrounding the White House, leaving the president vulnerable. He thought that soldiers weren't yet willing to fight for slaves. It was one thing to fight for the Union, but not for slaves. And in any case, even in the North, where people were sometimes more welcoming towards blacks, most people weren't yet ready to welcome slaves. Lincoln had an important decision, and he, in the end, decided to write the Emancipation Proclamation. I knew you could do it. Your heart is great, Mr. President. There was one problem, though. You haven't seen the last of me, Lincoln. After all, there's only one way for you to emancipate the slaves. Though he did write the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't free a single slave, not yet. It would be up to the Union and the slaves who joined it to finally fight and win the battle for slavery to end. Let's look at where we've been so far. The battles of the Civil War. Take out your scorecard. Let's check your answers. First up, you looked at the Battle of Fort Sumter, the first of the battles of the Civil War, though it was more of a bombardment, a lot of cannon fire. Only one person died, and that was an accident. The strange thing is that the Union surrendered in its very first battle. Its major battles, its major leaders, were Robert Anderson of the Union and General Beauregard of the Confederacy. Odd that people gathered around the harbor in Charleston to witness what they thought would be great entertainment. A strange kind of entertainment from our perspective. The first major battle of the Civil War, one to take place on a field of battle, was the Battle of Bull Run, the first of them, sometimes known as the Battle of Manassas. The major players were General Stonewall Jackson. He was a formidable or powerful opponent of the Union, and his brilliant strategies created another victory for the Confederacy. This would have been the first time that many Union soldiers heard the terrifying scream, later known as the Rebel Yell. Then there was the Battle of Shiloh, bloody Shiloh, one of the most destructive and violent battles in the entire war. It's difficult to say who won. On the one hand, the Confederacy claims to have won, and yet the Union claimed or said that it had won the counterattack on the second day of battle, a sudden resurgence or rising up of Union forces. I guess in the end we might say both sides lost. Everyone loses in war. The Battle of Antietam was one of the most important episodes in the entire war. In this picture, we can see President Lincoln standing among the victorious Union officers. But it was a hollow victory. It was extremely costly to the Union. And although it suffered the first major defeat for the Confederacy, it cost both sides many lives. Union officers and soldiers died in greater numbers than those of the Confederates. A very strange thing happened at Antietam. It may be that the victory of the Union was due to an accident, a coincidence, a strange turn of luck. It may be that the battle plans of the Confederate side had been lost. You see, they were wrapped in a cigar paper, which an officer seems to have misplaced. Imagine how history may have changed if those secret plans had not fallen into the hands of the Union. This was the battle that President Lincoln was looking for. This was the battle that encouraged him to finally muster the strength to create the Emancipation Proclamation. He thought it would make it easier to convince his friends in the North that slavery was worth abolishing. Then came Gettysburg. Gettysburg is known as a turning point in the war. The Confederacy had tried bravely and desperately to invade the Union at Pennsylvania. There were 3 days of grueling, gruesome attacks, but finally, the Confederates were forced to retreat. This was known as a turning point, a point at which the war seemed to be in favor of the Union. Even though the Union suffered heavy losses, the Confederates too suffered heavy losses. The Union, however, was able to draw on more reinforcements to bring in soldiers from all around the many northern states, something that General Lee was unable to do. Never again would the Confederacy try to invade the Union, and this was the first of a long series of crippling defeats for the South. The siege of Vicksburg was one of the more disturbing moments in the war. Over several months, the people of Vicksburg, Mississippi, were slowly strangled as the Union surrounded them and prevented supplies from entering, a strategy known as a siege. It may have been because of events like the siege of Vicksburg that the forces of the Confederacy found it was impossible to continue. I want to look at Gettysburg, those 3 crucial days in July, the turning point. As we read, "The tide turns," I'd like you to think of questions that you might ask. Form questions about what we've read. Turn to someone in the room, or if you'd like, you can talk into the screen. Asking questions about what you've read is an excellent way to remember. When you hear the sound of the drummer boy Jackson, it's time to ask a question. Follow along with me. You can read in the packet, or you can read right off the screen. The tide turns. A new year. As the year 1863 began, things continued to go badly for the Union on the battlefields of the East. Just the month before, in December 1862, the Union Army had tried once again to take Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. But before they could get there, Robert E. Lee met the Union Army and defeated them in a brilliant victory at Fredericksburg. In May 1863, a Union army of 130,000 men, the largest yet assembled or brought together, headed toward Richmond again. Lee's army, with only half as many troops, took them on at Chancellorsville, Virginia. Once again, Lee and Stonewall Jackson managed to come out on top through their daring strategy. The South did suffer a great loss at Chancellorsville, however. In the confusion of the battle, General Jackson was mistakenly shot by one of his own men. He was shot by a fellow Confederate. His left arm had to be amputated or cut off. For a time it seemed he might recover, but then infection set in, and Jackson died. Chancellorsville was Robert E. Lee's most brilliant victory. No one knew it then, but it was to be his last important victory. In the West, General Grant's army had continued to gain victories in western Tennessee and Mississippi. By spring of 1863, there were only 2 rebel strongholds remaining along the Mississippi. And now, form a question about what we've just read. Look over the text if you need to think of something. The most important of these victories was Vicksburg, Mississippi. If Vicksburg fell to the Union Army, the Union would control the entire Mississippi River. The western states of the Confederacy would be cut off from the others, and the anaconda would squeeze ever more tightly around the Confederacy. Think about the power of an anaconda constricting or squeezing its enemy. Now, what kind of literary device is that? It's a comparison, but it doesn't use like or as. It looked like that would happen. Just 2 weeks after Lee's victory at Chancellorsville, Lee learned that Grant had laid siege to Vicksburg. That means he had surrounded it and could prevent supplies and troops from going in to help the 30,000 Confederate troops who were trapped there. It seemed only a matter of time until the city fell to unconditional surrender Grant. That was his nickname, by the way. Ulysses S. Grant, or U.S. Grant, became unconditional surrender. The siege of Vicksburg made Lee see that he would need to do more than fight a defensive war against invading Union troops. He would need to go on the attack. Form a question about the parts that we just read. Turn to a neighbor if you have one, or you can say it into the screen. Pause the video if you need a moment to think. Lee would need to take the war into the north and win battles on northern soil. Then the enemy might finally lose heart and agree to peace. He needed an invasion of the Union. Lee's plan was to march across Maryland and into southern Pennsylvania. A victory there would threaten both Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was far from his home base in Virginia, but Lee knew his army could live off the foods grown on the rich farmlands of Maryland and Pennsylvania. Think to yourself, why would Southerners have the advantage of living off the land? What part of their lifestyle had allowed them to develop that advantage? It was an industry. He would be able to seize other supplies, like desperately needed shoes, as he captured towns. Gettysburg. And so, Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia arrived in the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on July 1st, 1863. As it happened, a Union army led by General George Meade was also in the area, Lincoln had put Meade in charge of Union armies in the East only 3 days before. No one had planned for a battle to take place in Gettysburg, but there they were, face to face. For the next 3 days, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, a battle raged between the Confederate and Union armies. Again and again Lee's forces attacked. Again and again Union forces threw them back. On July 3rd, Lee decided on one final attack, which he hoped would break the Union's resistance. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 15,000 men under the command of General George Pickett emerged from the woods and began their advance across an open field toward the Union's line. The attack, later called Pickett's Charge, was incredibly brave, but it failed. Form a question about what you've just read. The Union Army opened fire with its big guns as well as with muskets. Pickett's army, as one Confederate officer reported, just seemed to melt away in the blue smoke which now covered the hill. Nothing but stragglers came back. With a third of his army lost, there was nothing for Lee to do now but retreat, to run away. On July 4th, America's Independence Day, his exhausted, downhearted men started back toward Virginia in a pouring rain. To get there, they would have to cross the Potomac River. President Lincoln, who had been kept informed of events, realized that this was a chance to trap Lee and the rest of his army. He telegraphed General Meade, urging him, begging him to pursue Lee. But Meade, like McClellan before him, the general who had led the Union so far, was too cautious. By the time he was ready to move, Lee's army had safely crossed the Potomac River and was out of his reach. "We had them within our grasp," complained the frustrated president. But once more, Lee had escaped. Even so, Gettysburg was a major defeat for the Confederacy. Never again would its army invade the North. The tide of battle in the East now turned in the Union's favor. Meanwhile, on the West, Vicksburg surrendered to Grant. It gave up on that same July 4th, giving the Union control of the entire Mississippi River from its source to its mouth. Independence Day, 1863, turned out to be a great day for the Union. Some months later, the citizens of Gettysburg held a ceremony to honor those who had died in the great battle. I'd like you to make one more question, one final question about what we've just read. And about that gathering, to give the main speech at the memorial, they had invited a man named Edward Everett of Massachusetts, known as the greatest orator or public speaker of that time. President Lincoln had been invited to make a few remarks, and he had come also, but he and everyone else understood that it was Everett who was to be the star of the occasion. And Everett did indeed give a very fine speech, which lasted nearly 2 hours. Near the end of the afternoon, President Lincoln was called upon for his remarks. He spoke for just 2 minutes, and was done. It's funny how things work out sometimes. Edward Everett spoke for 2 hours, and while he gave a fine speech, no one today remembers a word of it. Abraham Lincoln spoke for just 2 minutes, and his speech has become the most famous in American history. Lincoln had wanted to use this speech to explain the real meaning of the war, that it was really about the ideas found in the Declaration of Independence, that it was about liberty and about equal rights and about democracy. Most of the president's listeners that day didn't quite realize the importance of what he said. But Everett, the speaker, knew it immediately. Walking over to Lincoln, Everett said, "Mr. President, I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of this occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Let's look at what Lincoln actually said. In what is now known as the Gettysburg Address. The language is challenging, but see if you can follow what Lincoln is saying. "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived, or born, in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition, or the idea, that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure, can survive. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who died here, that the nation might live. This we may in all propriety do, but in a larger sense we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate or make holy. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have hallowed it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember, what we say here, while it can never forget what they did here." Here, of course, he's referring to the death, the sacrifice of so many soldiers. "It is rather for us, the living, to here be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, their lives. That we here highly resolve these dead shall not have died in vain, for nothing. That this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth." What was Lincoln saying? We may have fine words about democracy, and we may pledge to uphold or to defend, protect, or preserve the ideas established or set forth in the Declaration of Independence. But it was the people at Gettysburg and the people throughout the Civil War who died fighting for liberty that gave the greatest gift of all. If nothing else, I think Lincoln's speech, the Gettysburg Address, was his way of confirming what the Emancipation Proclamation had started to say. It was his way of saying, as if there were any doubt remaining, yes, this is a war to end slavery. This is a war about freedom. This is a war about liberty. And this is the most important pillar, the most important idea of an American democracy. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is now one of the most important documents about freedom in American history. Here he is, in one of the few photographs, surrounded by people there to honor the dead. They must have had no idea how famous his 2-minute speech would become. Gettysburg was a turning point in the war. Things were starting to look up for the Union after that, and now the war could draw to a close. Follow along with me 2 more chapters for the day, and as you follow along with me in the video or in the packet, I'd like you to take some notes. The war draws to a close. Remember our metaphor about the anaconda, squeezing its prey to death. Follow along. A battle in the wilderness. Fight and fight some more and pursue. That is exactly what unconditional surrender Ulysses S. Grant did in spring of 1864. Once again, the scene was Northern Virginia. Once again, the prize was Richmond, capital of the Confederacy, and once again the armies met and did battle near Chancellorsville, where 1 year earlier Lee had won his most brilliant victory. But this time it was different. The fighting took place in a heavy forest known as the Wilderness. Grant's army outnumbered Lee's by nearly 2 to 1. For 5 days, the Battle of the Wilderness raged. It was a terrible, bloody battle, and at the end, Grant had lost more men than Lee. But Grant knew that his losses could be replaced, and Lee's could not. Before we continue, the Battle of the Wilderness is one of the most disturbing moments in the Civil War. You see, there had been a battle that had taken place recently, just about a year earlier, near Chancellorsville and in the Wilderness, and there had remained behind many of the dead from that battle. Some were placed in shallow graves and others remain among the fallen leaves. Well, at this time of the second battle, it was rather dry. There was a series of rains followed by a terrible drought, and in the change in the weather, some of the remains of the dead had emerged as skeletons. And of course, after the beginning of the drought, the dry leaves could easily be set ablaze, creating a terrible forest fire, along with exposing the remains of those who had died. It was one of the worst moments, a nightmarish moment in the war. And back to our text. Lee had to pull back, stopping several times to fight some more. Grant's army continued to press forward toward Richmond and Petersburg, an important railroad center near Richmond. Finally, Grant had his armies in position to begin a siege. They surrounded, in front of the 2 cities. That summer, and then through the autumn and winter, Grant's army kept Lee's troops in Richmond and Petersburg from breaking out. They could only retreat and abandon the cities. All the while, Grant received fresh troops and supplies. Lee received none. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was now in charge of Union forces in the West, prepared to tighten the squeeze of the anaconda. With an army of 90,000, Sherman set out from Tennessee toward the east. His path would take him through Alabama, and then to Georgia, where he planned to capture the important railroad city of Atlanta. Sherman didn't worry about food for his army. He would take that from the farms along the way. This was the South, after all, a place of agriculture. In Georgia, Sherman began the practice of what is known as total war. That meant that he not only fought the other side's soldiers, but also destroyed their farms, burned their warehouses and barns, wrecked their shops, and tore up their rail lines. Sherman did whatever he could to weaken the enemy, even though he was bringing misery to people who weren't soldiers, civilians. It was a cruel way of fighting, and sadly, it has served as an example for armies in other wars around the world. By September 1864, Atlanta had fallen to Union troops. From there, Sherman led his army on a march to the sea, as it was known, again destroying everything that they came upon in a path 40 miles wide. In December, the seacoast city of Savannah fell. By January, Sherman was in South Carolina, where the first of the states to secede. By March, he was in North Carolina. Everywhere his armies went, they left behind destruction and hatred and bitterness, too. By this time, Abraham Lincoln had been elected to a second term in office. He was the incumbent. His opponent was none other than the very general he had removed from command, George B. McClellan. McClellan said that if elected, he would end the war quickly. To people who were tired of war and sick of the terrible losses, that was very appealing. Lincoln, who was determined to see the war through to the end in order to preserve the Union and free the slaves, could make no such promise. For a time he expected to lose the election. Then came the news of Sherman's capture of Atlanta and of several other Union victories. Northern spirits rose, and Lincoln won re-election easily. By the time Lincoln's second term began in March 1865, it was clear that the Confederacy was doomed. Lincoln realized that it was time to get Americans to focus on the next great task before them, to reunite the nation. It would be possible after 4 years of killing and destruction for people on each side to understand the pain and suffering of the other side. Many Northerners talked of revenge, of getting even for what the South's secession had caused. Many wanted to treat the Southerners as a conquered people. With malice, bad will toward none. That was not Lincoln's way. Revenge and such. The Union had been preserved. Slavery had been ended. Enough. The job now was to get back to being one nation, the United States of America, and to fulfill its promise of greatness. President Lincoln had already announced his plan for restoring the Union. It was a plan to bring the southern states back into the Union quickly and without harsh punishment, as you will read later. In his second inaugural address on March 4, 1865, he urged Americans to adopt a forgiving spirit as they set about this task. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, soldiers, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. All that remained was for Grant's armies to finish the job. 3 weeks after Lincoln's speech, Petersburg and Richmond, capital of the Confederacy, fell. Lee tried to gather his weary and hungry army once more, but he was pursued by Union forces. There was finally no way out. On April 9th, Lee sent an officer with a white flag of surrender to the Union Army and asked to meet with General Unconditional Surrender Grant. The surrender took place at a farmhouse in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Grant wrote out the terms of surrender. The Confederates would turn in their weapons, except for the officers' small guns. All were free to leave, and, added Grant, let all the men who claim to own a horse or mule take the animals home with them to work their little farms. It was a generous offer, and Lee thanked Grant for it. Then Lee climbed on his horse, Traveler, looked thoughtfully over the field of Union soldiers, and rode away. The American Civil War was over. April 14th, 1865. Victory at last! News of Lee's surrender at Appomattox on April 9th quickly reached Washington. The next day, cannons boomed, fireworks exploded over the Potomac River, and the stars and stripes hung everywhere. The celebration spilled over to the next day, April 11th. That afternoon, a crowd had gathered at the White House called out, "Speech, speech!" John Wilkes Booth. In the audience was an actor named John Wilkes Booth. When the president finished speaking, Booth turned to a friend and snarled, "That's the last speech he will ever make." Lincoln had seen Booth perform often at Ford's Theater, which was not far from the White House. He had enjoyed the actor's work. He did not know that even then Booth was his mortal enemy. Even as a teenager, John Wilkes Booth had talked about doing great deeds someday. "I must have fame, fame," he told friends. He said he had to do something never before accomplished, something no other man would probably ever do. Booth was a racist through and through. He believed that slavery was good and that the South's cause was right. During the war, he served as a secret agent for the Confederacy. In his mind, no one was more responsible for the defeat of his beloved South than President Lincoln, and for that, Lincoln must pay. Booth's first plan was to kidnap Lincoln, take him to Richmond, and offer to exchange him for all the Confederate soldiers who were prisoners of war. When that didn't work, he decided to kill Lincoln. President Lincoln had received many threatening letters during his presidency, but he simply threw them away. He refused to take such threats seriously. After all, no one had ever killed an American president before. When friends urged him to use guards, Lincoln said that having guards protect him against angry Southerners would only put the idea of killing him into their heads. And, as to the crazy folks, why, I must only take my chances. Lincoln shot at Ford's Theater. On Friday, April 14th, 3 days after the speech that Booth had heard, the president met with his cabinet or advisers and a special guest, General Grant. Grant and his wife had been invited by the Lincolns to attend a play with them that evening at Ford's Theater. Grant had to decline or say no to the invitation, and Lincoln really didn't feel like going without him. But he knew that his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, looked forward to going, and the people of Washington were expecting him to make an appearance, so the Lincolns went to the theater. Sitting in the special presidential box just to the side of the stage, the president seemed to enjoy the show. Booth picked his time well. He knew the play on stage. He knew every line of it. In the third act, there was one line that always brought a lot of laughter. That moment, with the laughter distracting the audience, that would be the moment to strike. Booth approached the door that opened into the back of the presidential box. The guard who was supposed to be there had left his post. Booth entered. As the actor on stage said the line and the audience laughed, Booth raised his pistol and from 6 feet away fired into the back of the president's head. After shooting Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth jumped from the presidential box onto the stage. He then moved quickly to the railing of the box, shouted, "Revenge for the South!" then jumped down onto the stage and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis!" a Latin phrase that means "thus always" to tyrants. By the way, where else have you heard of someone speaking Latin the moment they assassinate someone? That's right. Not only was Sic semper tyrannis the motto of the state of Virginia, it's believed to have been spoken by none other than Brutus on assassinating someone whom he thought was a tyrant, Julius Caesar. Sic semper ervelo mortem tyrannis, he may have said. Thus always I bring death to tyrants, to cruel leaders. Booth, who had broken his leg when he landed on the stage, managed to escape. But as an actor well known to the public, he was immediately recognized. Booth avoided capture for nearly 2 weeks, but he was finally found hiding in a barn and was shot. As for the wounded president, he was carried to a house across the street, where friends and a doctor tried to make him comfortable. But there was no hope that he would live. Even the most modern of medical care today could not have saved him. The following morning, he breathed his last. "Now," said his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, "he belongs to the ages." Booth believed he was striking a blow for the South. He could not have been more mistaken. It was Lincoln who had said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, goodwill for all." It was Lincoln who held out the best hope for a peace without bitterness and revenge. It was Lincoln who spoke of bringing the Southern states back into the Union as quickly as possible. And now Lincoln was gone. This was the first time an American president was to be assassinated, killed in office. Sadly, it wouldn't be the last. The front page of newspapers across the nation bore the picture of Lincoln with the terrible news, death of the president. This photograph shows some strange objects. There's a whittling knife, a billfold or a wallet, which had in it some American, some Union and Confederate bills. There's a key fob, something attached to a key, and a pair of spectacles, which had been repaired by the president. These, along with a pocket watch, are the contents of the possessions that were in Lincoln's pockets when he was killed. Why am I showing you this? These objects are now in the care of the United States government at the Smithsonian Center in Washington. Now, there's several things I like to consider when I look at these objects. Let's look at the knife. Abraham Lincoln was in the habit of whittling. He often carried little pieces of wood and shaved off the edges, and cut into it, and leaving shavings all around the White House, much to the anger of Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, and the staff that cleaned up after him. But this tells us something about Lincoln, something that I think gives me comfort when I think about it. Lincoln was known for often throwing his feet up on the furniture at the White House. He often invited regular people into the White House, and he would sit and whittle away with that pocket knife while he chatted with people. He told jokes. Sometimes his jokes were quite silly, but they almost always brought people, normal people, regular civilians, as well as his cabinet or advisors. He brought them joy and laughter. This is very interesting because the evidence tells us that Lincoln himself was a very sad man. His sadness, of course, came from the war, but may have come even before then. He seems to have suffered from melancholy or sadness his whole life. And yet, stretching out on the White House furniture, resting his feet on the tables, whittling, leaving little shavings of wood all around the floor, telling jokes and making people feel at ease, was very natural for him. It was his way, I think, of making people comfortable with him, to think of him not as president, but as someone who was on their side. As for the billfold, the wallet with the Confederate bills, this is also very interesting. It had Confederate money inside. Now, we do know that Lincoln around this time had actually gone to the southern border to meet with some southern representatives. He was trying to organize a new law, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which we'll read about soon. So Lincoln had been to this Confederacy. It wasn't a great voyage or mission as a spy, but he was there, though in secret, he was there to try to get the southern states to end slavery as they came back to the Union. Eventually they would. I think he kept the Confederate money for another reason. I think it reminded him that the Confederacy, too, was a place where Americans were, that we were all Americans. African Americans and whites, Southerners, Northerners, Confederates and Union people, all of us were Americans. It was his way of remembering that episode in history where we were divided. But there's another reason why I show you these strange objects, otherwise unremarkable objects. They're at the Smithsonian Museum. It's a museum dedicated to preserving or keeping for all of time the history of the United States. But the Smithsonian has a very interesting policy, a rule. It doesn't keep the personal belongings or possessions of individual people. Except for these objects. Now, why do you think that of all the people, Abraham Lincoln's possessions, few though they were, those that were in his pockets, are on display for people from all around the world to see? Think about it for a moment. Why would they break their own rule, the Smithsonian Center? It tells you something about just how lovely Abraham Lincoln was. Just how important he was to American history.